Buried under here are our water lines. Our water lines actually run about 250 feet plus to get to our well house. So we have a really long run here, and I'm going to show you how we did this because it's important to do your water lines correctly. A lot of people would come out and say, hey, we're just going to take a ditch witch and run a trench and install your little flimsy water line with your power lines out to the well, and that's all it takes. It takes a lot more than that if you don't want to be redigging a 250 foot deep or 250 foot long ditch to make repairs. So what we actually did is the water line has to be down 18 inches. And actually coming through this same spot are our buried power lines. Those are down about 36 inches. So we dug this ditch at about 24 inches using an excavator. By digging it down 24 inches with an excavator, that actually gave us a little bit of extra room, which we used productively. We got a truckload of clean sand fill dirt. The reason why we got a truckload of clean sand dirt is we have a lot of rocks in our soil. So as weather expands and contracts the ground, these rocks are going to push around, and it doesn't take much for a rock to put a dent in your water line. You get a dent in your water line, the next thing you know, you have a puddle out in the yard and your water is just spewing out somewhere. So we put in about 6 inches of sand in the bottom of our trench once we dug it. Just basically had somebody dumping it, had somebody else smoothing it out. And that 6 inches of sand was put down before we put down the water lines and the power lines. After we had the sand completely spread out, then we laid out our water and power lines. And those can just lay next to each other. We had 2 power lines going out because we have a sub panel for an external building that we ran in the same ditch. But the main thing when you're using these water lines is to make sure you get a good PSI water line, and depending on the distance that you're running, make sure that you're using the right gauge wire. We used a 10-3. You probably, depending on the distance you're running, might want to go up to an 8. Definitely don't want to go down to a 12. You want to be in the 10 to 8 range when you're running a 220 well pump 250 feet away. And you want to use outdoor wire. So we ran the wire on top of that 6 inches of clean fill dirt, and then we put another 6 inches of clean fill dirt down on top of the wires and the well lines to bury it. The reason being is that we're protecting those lines from movement in the soil of rocks, because we don't want rocks penetrating it. So the sand clean fill dirt kind of insulates those lines and gives them further protection, which is going to add to the longevity of this 250 foot trench we had to dig to get to our well. Once you have all of that cleanly filled in, you could go ahead and back in your dirt. I would suggest having this inspected before you cover your lines, but if you're not worried about permits and inspections, you can go ahead and fill it in. And you just fill it all the way in to each end. The hardest part about this isn't so much digging the trench, that's time consuming, and filling it in with sand and stuff. It's actually getting the well lines into the well house and into the house. At the well house, we just had to kind of dig a ditch underneath the footing. The footing is only about 6 inches because it's a very small external building. And we ran our lines in under there, and once they're inside the house is there to protect everything. They just run up out of the ground. Underneath the house, the footing is much deeper. So we actually came up at an angle slightly as we approached the house. So it's not quite as deep right at the house, but we know where the well lines are. We know how to protect those. And then we drilled a hole going into the foundation and out the other side. When you do that, you need to make sure that your well line is sleeved with PVC and then caulked in the sleeve so that there's no movement, there's no moisture that can come in and out of there around that well line. And The reason being is well lines, even if you use the best PSI you can find, they can still be penetrated, and you don't want them rubbing up against things like concrete over a long period of time. So make sure you have that sleeve going into the foundation of your house, and then once it's under there, you're going to hook it up to wherever you would hook it up in your house. Our power lines, we actually just kind of hooked into our external power box or power panel, which is also right here. So those come up, and then they are also in conduit coming out of the ground and into the power box, because once they come up from underneath the ground, once they're up more than 6 inches, they're really not protected at all. So you want to make sure that conduit runs down all the way down that 18 inches, and that those power lines are protected as they come up and go into the power box. So that's basically all there really is to it, to running your well lines. But please don't use a ditch witch. Do this correctly. Dig it out with an excavator. Use your filter. That's where the longevity of your well lines